Good morning. Thank you for joining the Otter Creek family this Sunday. This is a little bit unusual experience for us because we had a lightning strike at the Brentwood campus. And so Cole and our team have been scrambling to think about what the weekend is going to look like. The way this affects you, those who are joining us online, is that we're not going to have our normal offering. And so we apologize for that inconvenience. We're trying to make the best of it. But here's the situation. I'm going to give you kind of a brief synopsis of the sermon, just as a little bit of an overview in this series on deconstruction and reconstruction. We're only going to do one take of this. This is not supposed to be a slick production, so I might mess up or say something and then correct it. We're not going to go back and edit and fix all of it, but we did want you to know about how the conversation on faith and doubt, deconstruction and reconstruction is happening live at both campuses, even while you're at home trying to figure out what is happening. So we're going to make the best of this. Thank you for joining us online. Many of you join us every week. And let me just remind you that if you're someone who's joining us online, would you just let us know who you are? You can put something in the comment section, however you're watching this, whatever platform you're using. Let us know, or email David Knox at Otter Creek Church. It's just DKNOX, D-K-N-O-X at ottercreek.org. We would love to know how we could get you more connected into the flesh and blood relational life of this church. You might live somewhere outside of Nashville or Tennessee. Still let us know who you are. But you also might live right here in Nashville, and we want to know who you are, how we can serve you, and to get to know you. In our 3 services today at both campuses, I'll be introducing my preaching intern for the summer. His name is Cooper Seidman. He's a student at Abilene Christian in Texas. I've known Cooper for a long time. His family's very close to my family. This is the first time I've had the space kind of in my bandwidth to have an intern. So I'm really excited that I get to pour into Cooper the way so many other women and men poured into me when I was in my early 20s. So again, for those of you joining us online, we'll be introducing Cooper to the church. You will see him over the summer if you join us online. And we just want to encourage him and be a blessing to the way that God is helping him figure out his gift and his calling. So here's where we are in this series. We've had a number of guest speakers. I've done about half the teaching. We've had a little more than half the teaching. We've had some guest teachers. And we've been talking about faith and doubt in the United States, what some call postmodern America, or this era of deconstruction, in anchoring it in a paradigmatic big text, meaning a text that is orienting, big enough, deep enough, wide enough, a story that's smart enough to understand the complexities of our cultural moment. And so what I've suggested, kind of from a philosophy of religion, how do you know what you know, is that the Emmaus Road story is big enough and deep enough to hold all the questions that we have about God and suffering and doubt, and what about corrupt preachers and corrupt politicians and institutions that we're not sure if we can trust. I'm suggesting Emmaus Road has enough in it to be our guide as we move from deconstruction to reconstruction, doubting God to rebuilding our faith in a robust God. That's the movement that we're on in this series. Next week, and we should have our streaming back next week, but next week, we're actually going to have a series of testimonies in which I have a conversation with some different women and men who are part of this church who have gone through their own seasons of deconstruction. And I think you'll find that interesting because they will be able to talk to you about your faith in a way that I can't as the preacher. They will be talking to you from their own everyday, real life experiences. So here's the framing idea for this whole conversation. And this is one of the things I really want people to understand why this conversation is so important. We're in a cultural shift that we have not seen in decades. There's no reason to complain about it or whine about it, but people do not care about church like they used to. In some ways, people do not care about God like they used to, but certainly people do not care about church like they used to. Globally, this is a different conversation. Everything I've been talking about the last 2 months is just in relationship to the church, or what we would know as Christianity in the United States. Several groups like the Pew Forum, the Barna Group, have done extensive sociological studies over the last 20 years. And essentially what they say is, while we have seen a sharp decline in those who identify as Christian and those who identify as people who value local church, as that has declined, the number of people who identify as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, has increased. So as faith in God, what we would traditionally call, in theology, we would call theism, while that seems to be declining, like we see in Europe, increasing is the number of people who say, I'm still spiritual, but I'm not religious. Meaning, I still think about things that matter. I still think about God and creation, but I no longer find institutional expressions of Judaism and Christianity relevant in helping me understand this mysterious God that I'm pursuing. And instead of complaining or whining about it or being angry, what I've suggested in this series is that we can step back and understand why. How did we get here? 20 years ago, almost 80% of Americans identified as Christian. That number is down almost 20% in 15 years. The number of people who identified 20 years ago as a none, N-O-N-E, was 17%. 20 years later, that number is almost 30%. That's a percent increase per year in a country of about 350 million people. That's a staggering idea. What is that going to look like in 30 years, 40 years, 70 years? We don't know for sure. But what I'm suggesting is this is a humbling moment for those of us who believe in the story of God in the Old and the New Testament to ask the question, why? Why is always more important than what? What is what I just described? Religion decreasing, the rise of the nones increasing. That's the what. But the why could be summarized like this. Number one, apathy. People went through COVID and it's just easier not to be part of a church. You have more time to go to the lake house, to do soccer matches. Some people looked at their family systems of shame and toxicity and attached it to church and said, well, my family was complicated and my family went to church, so I don't want to have anything to do with church. Or maybe you grew up in a healthy family, but you realize your healthy family had a hard time in a toxic church environment. And so either way, you feel like you can't escape toxicity. Some people walk away from church because of the false divide between faith and science. So it's not just apathy. It's not just family of origin issue. It's not just unhealthy church system. It's people are asking me to check my brain at the door. I listened to an interview recently with the director of the Human Genome Project, Dr. Francis Collins, who's a devout believer. He's a Jesus person. Arguably, he's the most important scientist in the world right now. Everything that we know about the human genome and DNA and everything that we've developed in terms of cancer research and cancer treatment is a direct result of this 30-year project that Collins is part of. Collins was interviewing the lead scientist who helped develop the first vaccine during COVID-19. So the first vaccine that was available in 2021, 2022 was developed by a scientist who herself was a devout Christian. And Collins and this other scientist were talking about what scientists need from churches. And Collins said this, scientists who are believers need to know that their church believes they are doing sacred work. What Collins was saying is that churches, especially Protestant low churches in America, for too long have divided you're either a person of faith or a person of science. And Collins, in his famous work, The Language of God, argues that faith and science are two different ways of talking about the same God. One is French, one is Italian, but they're both talking about the same thing. And that's one of the reasons that Americans have walked away from church. They believe that if you have to be part of a church, you have to quit on science. And so they don't want any part of that. So there's multiple reasons that people walk away from faith. Some people walk away because of true intellectual inquiry, like the reverse of C.S. Lewis. They started out in faith, they deconstructed, they read The New Atheist, they've listened to all these philosophers of religion, and they simply don't believe anymore. What we owe people on an individual basis is to hold them as sacred, to listen to them, and to ask them why. Okay, I know the what. You don't think it's relevant. You don't believe in God. You don't think the red letters of Jesus are powerful anymore. I respect that, but why? How did we get here? And that's what I've been suggesting. It's the responsibility of Christians now to listen to our friends who have walked away from God or who have walked away from the church. And so I'm asking us as believers to lean into the story of two friends who have completely experienced delusionment. They're deconstructing their faith in real time, and they're doing it on Easter Sunday. They're walking the 7-mile track from Jerusalem to the suburbs of Emmaus, and they're done. They're out. They've quit. All the evidence around them, as you might experience today in America, all the evidence is suggesting, look, this faith thing worked for you a while, but it works until it doesn't work. And it's in that space of liminality, that transition between going to church in Jerusalem and going to the comfort and the certainty of their own home, that Jesus comes to them. He quizzes them. He talks to them about the Bible. He reveals who Jesus is in relationship to the Bible. He affirms their curiosity. He messes with them. And then he reveals his full person and his full power when he's in their home in the breaking of bread. And I've suggested just methodically weighing that story is enough to sustain us in the way that we think about deconstruction and reconstruction. Now, next week, we'll hear 3 different stories, 3 different testimonies. But what I want to do just for a few moments is suggest that the why is often part of the deconstruction, but the what do we do next is the most important thing. And too many times theologians and preachers get to the what should we do now or what should we do next, and they haven't properly lived in the how did we get here, the why. So we've lived in the why for 6 weeks now, and it's time to talk about the good news of this story. You cannot simply live in deconstruction. At some point, you have to reconstruct. One helpful metaphor that I offered that several people have commented, and part of this is just Nashville because neighborhoods are changing all the time, but there's this beautiful neighborhood right next to the Brentwood campus, where Brentwood campus is 409 Franklin Road, right in the heart of Brentwood. You can drive through here and see what I'm talking about. We have this amazing neighborhood next to the Brentwood campus that I walk almost every single morning. And as I'm walking, I'm watching these houses transform in real time. So what happens in these estates is professionals come in and they deconstruct the house, sometimes down to the bare bones is an expression that's used in construction. And then within 3 to 6 months, you can start to see the reconstruction process transforming the space. If someone came through and deconstructed the homes and didn't reconstruct, we wouldn't call it deconstruction. We would call it demolition. What makes it beautiful is that the tearing down leads to the rebuilding. And my experience is that a number of people start the deconstruction process because of experience, because of trauma, because of pain, because of disappointment with God, sickness, the death of a child. Some kind of rupturing event causes them to start deconstructing their simple beliefs in God. But because they feel isolated, they feel like it's too hard, they feel like they don't have the right tools, they don't do the reconstruction. And so what happens in America, metaphorically, is you have a bunch of homes that have been demolished, but not rebuilt. And what the church can do, what the synagogue can do, is what the church has been doing for 2,000 years, which is to teach people it's not so much that you're rejecting God, you're rejecting a simplistic, elementary school version of God that was good for you your first 20 years, but will not be a good enough version of God to sustain you for the next 40 or 50 years. That's what's called reconstruction. In Christian theology, we call resurrection. God takes the elements of all the disappointment, all the decay, and all the death, and God does something more than he could do before the death. Life comes out of death. Resurrection follows crucifixion. You can't have resurrection. You can't have new life unless something dies. And what needs to die sometimes is our simplistic notions of God. So if you're new to this series, go back and listen to old ones because I spent 20 or 30 minutes just unpacking the story in Luke 24. But if that story is a grounding text, the big word is paradigmatic text, like it's a text that counts more than other biblical texts count, there are some really practical things that we can understand about how Christians can move forward in a postmodern, deconstructing, some call it a secular society. The first is we shouldn't be afraid to read the Bible in a pluralistic society. You shouldn't be afraid to read the Bible in the midst of atheists, agnostic, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and especially those who identify as nothing. I have no religious commitment. I don't care. I just want to raise my kids and live a good life. We should not be afraid to read the Bible publicly in those conversations and to have conversations with people about the Bible. This Bible study that happens in the Emmaus Road doesn't happen in a church building, and it doesn't happen in someone's home. The Bible debate that Jesus has with these two presumably Jewish believers, it happens on a road. They're in public. Like, theology should be public. It's not private. Anywhere you go in any setting, we should be able to talk about how we think God is working in the world. And of course, people aren't going to agree with us. That's the world that we live in. But we should also acknowledge in the midst of this what Jesus does to the two people who are walking to Emmaus. He recognizes in their humanity that they are searching for transcendence. They want to believe that God exists. He messes with them. He's a little ornery. Are you foolish of heart? How long will you hide your wisdom or hide yourself from true knowledge in this situation, depending on how you translate the text there? But really, he's affirming their curiosity. They're curious for God. And so he affirms that. But most importantly, what Jesus teaches us and where we need to continue to lean in as churches is that our superpower is hospitality. Now, Jesus flips it in the story. He doesn't have a home to welcome people to. At least those 3 years he's public ministry, he's kind of couch surfing, right? He's relying on the generosity of others. So he relies on their hospitality to then host them at the table. He hosts them in their own home. Jesus does this all this time with the woman who takes the perfume and breaks it over and essentially anoints Jesus for his crucifixion, his resurrection. That's not his house that he's in. He's in a rich Pharisee's house, right? That guy gets offended and he uses this as an object lesson. So Jesus uses other people's hospitality to then welcome those people in their own home to a deeper truth. That takes courage. When someone hosts you, when someone's being hospitable to you, to turn it around and say, hey, just as you've brought me into something loving and generous, I want to bring you into something loving and generous. And that's what Jesus does. And that's not a Christian idea. That's a Jewish idea. That's a Jewish idea as old as Abraham in the book of Genesis, hosting angelic visitors who tell his wife and tell him about how God is going to give them a child. It's his hospitality of the angelic visitors that opens up this conversation about this incredible thing that God's going to do. And all throughout the book of Leviticus and the prophets, we see that hospitality is our chief way of engaging people in spiritual conversation. Jesus is hospitable in his conversation, in his body, in his presence, in his teaching, in his storytelling. He's even hospitable in the way that he enters into their home. So the more complicated the world gets, the more simple we make it. The crazier it gets out there, the more in here we make it about bread and wine, and carrot cake, chocolate cake, and bluebell ice cream. And we welcome people to tables at restaurants and in our own home. And that's where we have the work of evangelism, the work of sharing our faith. It's not going to be in big conferences. People are suspicious of that now. It's probably not even going to be preachers recording sermons in the basement of their church because their technology is not working correctly. It's going to happen one-on-one, three-on-three, small groups of people, 5 or 6 people around a table at a campfire, having a glass of wine, and somebody says, hey, have you ever wondered about... That's the moment when you take people who have been deconstructing their whole lives and you open up their eyesight and their imagination to the possibilities of reconstruction, of moving from doubt to a need from certainty to faith. That's what Jesus invites them to. He doesn't invite them to certainty. He invites them to faith. So may you know, wherever you are, if you're in your car right now, or if you're at home joining us for this online experience, may you know what these two individuals in Emmaus Road came to know. They thought their life was about being religious, going to church, and looking for God. And when they find profound disappointment with God, Jesus comes to them and reminds them, this is not about you looking for God. This is about me showing you the God who has been looking for you your whole life. Go in peace.